Welcome to something special. Welcome to TedX. This TedX event is part of a global conversation that takes place every day in every corner of the world. In schools, in theaters, in workplaces, even in prisons, people gather to hear the best ideas bubbling up in their communities. More than 3,000 TEDx events are held every year in 170 countries. It's a remarkable thing. TEDx events are self-organized under a license from TED, a non-profit organization devoted to discovering and sharing powerful ideas in the form of TED Talks. It's not TED itself, but your local TEDx team of volunteers that has done all the work to put on today's event, including booking all of the speakers. It's this team's ideas, dedication, and time that have made this possible. We really hope today's program sparks an exciting conversation. This is a day for curiosity and for skepticism, for inspiration and for action. The more you enter into it, the more you will take out. And now, on with the show.
Welcome back, everyone, to the second and final day of TEDx London Business School. As a reminder, I'm Andrew.
I'm Duarte.
And I'm Jabo.
And the three of us will be your MCs for the next hour and a half.
It's lovely to see so many familiar faces again, even those of you who thought they had their webcams turned off. Those dinners are looking very good. Just kidding. Feel free to put on those sweatpants and make yourself comfortable. Hey, virtual has to have some advantages. We hope you're ready for another evening of pure inspiration, from comedy to fascism and even baking. We have it all once again. Now, over to Jabo to get the party started.
Have you ever wondered why fake news usually travels much faster and farther than real news? Have you had this kind of experience where you encounter a piece of information that you obviously know is false, but you still go ahead to share it with people anyway? It's my great honor to introduce our first speaker today, Daniel Efron, Associate Professor of Organizational Behavior at London Business School. Daniel today is going to share his latest research, The Morality of Misinformation.
Society is currently facing what the World Health Organization calls an infodemic of misinformation. We're surrounded by fake news, by alternative facts, by a stream of falsehoods from business and political leaders. This misinformation harms individuals, organizations, society, and undermines the foundations of democracy. What can we do about it? Well, a lot of great research from social scientists and social media platforms have been helping people distinguish between what's fake and what's fact. But as a social psychologist who studies how people think about morality, my concern is that these efforts are insufficient. Because sometimes people recognize that misinformation is false, and they just don't care. Take, for example, fake news. Articles that are intentionally and verifiably false and that could mislead readers. Nationally representative survey data from the US and the UK suggests that between 14 and 17% of adults will admit to having shared fake news on social media, knowing at the time it was fake. So at least some of the time, some people have little compunction about spreading misinformation. The implication here is that to stop the spread of misinformation, we need to do more than to understand why people believe it. We also need to understand why people excuse it. So how do people decide whether misinformation is morally permissible to spread? Well, today I want to talk about one simple and scary factor, which is how familiar that misinformation is. Take, for example, the observation that political leaders sometimes repeat the same falsehood again and again and again and again, even hundreds of times, long after that falsehood has been thoroughly and publicly debunked. When they do this, the same person is likely to encounter that same falsehood more than one time. Or take the observation from research that fake news can spread on social media faster and farther than real news. When fake news does go viral, the same person is likely to encounter the same piece of fake news again and again and again. What happens when the same person encounters the same piece of misinformation multiple times? Well, I conducted a series of experiments testing the hypothesis that fake news will seem less unethical to spread when people have seen it before, even if they don't believe the fake news. Why would this happen? Well, if you've encountered the same piece of information multiple times, that piece of information will start to feel familiar. And prior research suggests that if information feels familiar, it will take on this quality that comedian Stephen Colbert referred to as truthiness. Truthiness is a gut feeling that there's something to that piece of information. And the gut feeling is different than what we believe. We can be incredibly confident in our heads that something is false, and yet not be able to shake the gut feeling that there's a ring of truthfulness to it. And I want to claim that that ring of truthfulness informs our moral judgments about misinformation, even when we know it's false. In other words, if we know that it's false with our heads, but we can't shake the feeling that it's true in our guts, we might think that that piece of misinformation is a little less unethical to spread. I tested this idea in a bunch of experiments, and I'll show you a couple of them today. This first experiment, we recruited some American participants online, and we showed them fake political news that had actually circulated on social media. Participants saw a headline and a photograph, and half of these headlines are meant to appeal to Democrats, and the other half are meant to appeal to Republicans. Turns out it didn't matter whether the fake news appealed to Democrats or Republicans. We got the same effects for both political groups. So we have 12 headlines. At the beginning of the study, we randomly select 6 headlines and show them to participants 4 times. For each headline, participants fill out a few different ratings of the headline, just as an excuse to get the headline in front of them. Then there's a brief delay, and 4 or 5 minutes later, participants see all 12 headlines, and they rate how ethical or unethical each one would be to share on social media. Now, half of these headlines they've seen at the very beginning of the study, and half of the headlines they've seen for the first time. So we're controlling whether the headlines are familiar to participants because they've seen them before, or whether they're new. Now, for all the headlines, we tell participants this is fake news. Nonpartisan fact-checking websites have debunked all this stuff. None of it is real. And the results show that participants believe us. They think that the headlines are completely fake, regardless of whether they've seen them before. So repeatedly encountering the same headline doesn't make it seem truer, but it does make it seem a little less unethical to spread. So here are the results for the question where we ask people how ethical or unethical it is to spread this headline on social media. And the ratings are made on a 100-point scale. You'll notice that I've truncated the y-axis. This is good news, because this means that the average participant thought it was pretty unethical to spread blatantly false misinformation. But as you'll see, we were able to push around just how unethical they thought it was. Participants thought it was less unethical to share fake news on social media when they'd seen that fake news a few minutes before than when they were seeing it for the first time. So, repeatedly encountering the same fake news article made it seem less unethical to spread. And these moral judgments that people make matter. We also found that if you'd seen a headline a few minutes before, you thought it was less unethical to spread, and the less unethical you thought it was to spread, the more likely you were to say that you would share it yourself on social media, or express approval by liking it. So the punchline of this and other experiments is that fake news seems less unethical to spread if you've seen it before, even when you know that it's false. These results suggest a real dilemma that fact-checkers face. If you want to debunk a false claim, you have to repeat the false claim. That is, you have to tell people what the falsehood is that you're debunking. And even if that debunking is successful, even if people no longer believe the falsehood, well, you've now made the falsehood familiar by repeating it. And if it feels familiar, people may think it's a little less unethical to spread. So what can we do about this? Well, one promising solution is to encourage people to think a little bit more carefully about the morality of sharing false content. This is referred to as moral deliberation, essentially using your head instead of your gut to evaluate whether it's right or wrong to spread content that you know is false. Some preliminary evidence for this idea comes from a second experiment that I'll share with you today. I recruited over 750 participants online from the US, and I put them through the same procedure that I told you about a few minutes ago. At the beginning of the study, people see 6 fake news headlines. After a brief delay, they see 12 fake news headlines, 6 of which they saw a few minutes ago, and 6 of which they're seeing for the first time. This time, however, everyone is told just before they make their final ratings either to think carefully about their moral judgments or to use their guts. More specifically, we randomly assigned half the participants to read instructions encouraging them to think a little harder about whether it's ethical or unethical to share content that's false on social media. We told them to ignore their gut feelings and to write down 2 reasons why they thought it was ethical or unethical to spread this information. The other half of participants, we randomly assigned to be encouraged to use their guts, to make their moral judgments based on their first instincts, and not to provide any sort of reasons why they thought it was right or wrong. So here are the results. Once again, higher numbers on the y-axis indicate that you think it's more unethical to share this content. Let's start with participants who were encouraged to use their guts in making their moral judgments. Here we see the same effect I showed you a few minutes ago. That is, people think it's less unethical to share fake news headlines that they know are fake if they've seen the headlines a few minutes before than if they haven't. But when we encourage people to use their heads instead of their guts, when we encourage them to think a little bit more carefully about their moral judgments, this effect becomes smaller. Now people think it's pretty unethical to share the fake news headlines, regardless of whether they've seen them before or not. So the punchline here is that repetition is making the headlines seem less unethical to share, but using moral deliberation makes this effect a little bit smaller. Now, there is a statistical caveat. We can be really confident that repeatedly encountering the same piece of fake news makes it seem less unethical to spread. We can be a little less confident that thinking hard eliminates this effect. The reason is that we planned 2 statistical analyses. One produced a statistically significant result. The other one, the result was not quite statistically significant. This means that before getting too excited about the idea that thinking hard makes everything better, we would want to repeat this experiment and see if we got the same results. So let me leave you with a few conclusions. Fighting misinformation requires doing more than just trying to understand why people believe it. We also need to understand why people excuse it. And my research suggests that people are more likely to excuse misinformation, even if they know that it's false in their heads, if it feels truthy in their guts. Now, this psychological tendency means that we are vulnerable to manipulation by people who want to spread misinformation. To get off the hook for dishonesty, these people don't need to convince us that what they're saying is true. All they need to do is repeat the same falsehood again and again and again. There are 2 important things we can do about this now. A good first step is to recognize that all of us are probably vulnerable to letting people off the hook a little bit more if they've repeated the same falsehood multiple times. Going further, I would encourage all of us to think a little bit more carefully about our moral values before we share content on social media that we know is false. More broadly, as a society, we should realize that addressing our current infodemic of misinformation requires doing more than convincing people that misinformation is factually false. We need to encourage people to think about whether spreading misinformation is morally wrong.
I hope that after watching that, we'll all think twice about sharing the latest article about how Bill Gates invented the pandemic to control us. Oh, I just did what Dr. Efron told me not to, didn't I? Anyway, our next speaker examines a resurgent political ideology that we hoped was an artifact of the early 20th century. He is a former UK diplomat and has advised a range of corporations, institutions and governments on international politics. He was actually the UK High Commissioner to my home country of Trinidad and Tobago. He is currently writing a book on the Britain and the breakdown of the global order. This is Arthur Snell.
About 10 years ago, my son was born. At the time, I was living overseas in Trinidad and Tobago, and he didn't have the right to citizenship of that country, so we applied for his British passport. And it was rejected. My son had become stateless. For a brief period, this was intensely stressful, as I tried to figure out what we were going to do. In the end, I was able to resolve the situation because I had connections, not because I had rights. At the same time in my country, Britain, state security institutions were imprisoning and deporting long-term, law-abiding residents who were rendered stateless as a result, without rights. When media pressure forced a U-turn of these policies, the same state institutions deliberately went slow on compensation and restitution, leaving some of the victims to die penniless in exile. I want to talk to you today about fascism. It's no longer a dark chapter of 20th century history. It's back, and it seems to be winning. Let's look at some examples. An unpopular government uses unconstitutional means to suspend the legislature in order to force through an ultra-nationalist political agenda. In another country, a former army captain comes to power after an explicitly racist political campaign. He institutes new laws that remove protections for indigenous minorities and celebrates a historic coup that had led to decades of military dictatorship. Elsewhere, an aggressively nationalist ruler makes himself ruler for life. He institutes a program of mass incarcerations of an ethnic minority and also pursues unfounded territorial claims against neighbours backed up with military threats. Somewhere else again, a traditionally secular state, a violent political movement seeks to redefine citizenship as based on religion. Members of religious minorities are subjected to violent pogroms, and the state turns a blind eye. Historic places of worship are bulldozed in an attempt to erase the religious minority's right to have ever been part of that country's story. And finally, an authoritarian president does everything he can to undermine faith in the outcome of an election that he's clearly lost. In a final desperate throw of the dice, he whips his supporters up into a violent frenzy and they attempt an insurrection against the country's legislature. And of course, I'm talking about the events of the 6th of January in Washington, D.C. You might recognise some of the other examples. The British government suspending Parliament, the fascist presidency of Bolsonaro in Brazil, the suppression of the Uyghurs in China, the ultra-nationalist Hindu movement in India. Okay, so I'm a liberal and I don't like those politics. But is it fascism? Do we need to use the F word? Is this even a useful term? If we call people fascist, do we lose the argument before it's even begun? Well, fascism doesn't actually have a single dictionary definition, but it's ultranationalism expressed in violent and authoritarian ways. And because fascism is nationalist, it takes a different form in every country. In the 20th century in the UK, fascists were obsessed with the history of England, Oliver Cromwell, Henry VIII. If you look in India, fascism has tried to incorporate ancient ideas of Hindu nationalism into its belief system. In America, fascists are trying to align their activities with the history of America's revolutionaries against the British colonial rule. It's always taking that national form. And the other thing about fascism is this confusion with Nazism. Nazism was fascism, but not all fascists are Nazis. So if we use that word, we're not saying that these people are behaving like Hitler, but you don't have to behave like Hitler to merit the description of fascism. Authoritarian nationalism is always a bad thing. It always brings with it oppression, arbitrary arrest and imprisonment, violence, denials of minorities' rights. We can't just stand around and saying, don't worry, they haven't opened any concentration camps yet, as if that means things are still okay. So why are these things happening? Well, there are lots of factors, some unrelated, but they've all come together. The traditional media has become hyper-partisan. Look at the way Fox News has covered the aftermath of the insurrection in America, constantly saying, well, we need to bring the country together. And yet Fox News has done more to put the country apart than almost any other channel. Social media concentrates people into bubbles. They're only talking to people they already agree with, or people who hold similar but more extreme views than themselves. And there's a dislocation associated with globalization. Many communities seeing their traditional industries and places of work closed down. The resulting disaffection with democratic politics is obvious. In 2008, 40% of people in democracies were dissatisfied. By 2020, that figure is 60%, and the numbers are higher in the larger democracies, such as the USA. And finally, there's the pandemic effect of fascist politics itself. It drives fear and hostility between countries, further empowering ultranationalism. And that has led to a concomitant collapse of the global order. Nobody believes in the UN or the EU anymore. It's all about my country first, America first, Britain first, China first, might over right. In spite of that, fascists will work together across international boundaries if it's in their interests. You look at the example of Trump addressing Hindu nationalist rallies in India, or Trump's advisor Steve Bannon helping far-right parties in Europe get to power. Vladimir Putin funding, again, far-right across the world. So fascists will work together while liberals are dissipated and divided. So why does this matter? Well, you don't have to wait for Nazism, for fascism to be a problem. I proposed this talk last year, long before the events of the 6th of January, but let's see where that has led, a violent insurrection at the American Congress. And there are other effects all over the world, the destruction of Brazil's rainforest, rise in sectarian violence in India. These are all features of 21st century fascism. Fascists work together, as we've seen, if their nationalist aims coincide. But fascism stops countries from working together in the global interest. If we're going to tackle the climate emergency, fascists have to lose power. But perhaps the most important point is that fascism isn't democracy. It's not what the people want. Donald Trump lost the election by millions of votes. Boris Johnson may have a large parliamentary majority in the UK, but he got that from 43% of the vote. Rodrigo Duterte in the Philippines, an outright fascist, won his election on 39% of the vote. It's not that fascists are what the people want, it's just that fascists are better at taking and holding on to power. So what can we do? I think there are three things. We have to fight complacency. If we look at recent events, Brexit, the election of Trump, there's been many occasions when people rather lazily thought they knew what the outcome was going to be. We have to recognise that there's a problem and take action. We can't wait for things to happen. Now, if you're not happy with the F word, I don't mind that much. But we can't pretend that normal politics is in play at the moment. The second thing is, I think we need to educate ourselves. I've done some research on this. I've seen that half the world's population are currently living in countries run by ultranationalists. Let's learn about that. Let's learn about how fascists operate. They dehumanize their opponents, they make them stateless, they take away their rights. But the other thing they do is they break constitutional orders. They behave in ways that cause accepted methods and behaviors to disappear. Look at what happened in America. America's constitution relied on the loser of a presidential election accepting the result and conceding. The refusal to do that has created what could easily turn into a violent insurgency in that country. And let's recognize that this is a global fight. It's not enough to worry about elections in your own country alone. You've got to think about what's happening to democracy everywhere. Educate yourself about the struggles of the democratic movement in Hong Kong, for example. Look at what's going on in India. Realize that this is a global issue. Now, there are things we probably shouldn't do. Shouting "you're a fascist" at the supporters of ultranationalism probably isn't going to help very much. We have to strengthen the appeal of the other side. Many of the people who've been dragged into supporting these politics are people who feel that they've lost their way, they've run out of options. We've got to give them reasons to leave those politics behind. So, final thoughts. I think a lot of people thought that if Joe Biden won the election in America, this would be a great setback for the politics of violence, of white nationalism, of anti-democratic forces. But what we've seen is the opposite. It's not just about the elections, it's about the norms of behaviour. The norms of political behaviour are being attacked by fascists. We have to stand firm, we have to reject that, and we have to remain vigilant.
A harrowing message from Arthur, forcing us to confront the brutal realities of today. On a lighter note, our next speaker has also done some confronting himself. As a former stand-up comedian and current head of comedy at Kent University, he has faced both audiences and students. A terrifying image. He comes to us with an interesting proposition. When you think of stand-up, do you associate it with theatre? Why? Or why not? From all around Kent, join me in welcoming the brilliantly creative Oliver Double.
Welcome to the show. I'm Ollie Double. Stand-up comedy is more theatrical than most theatre, and funnier too. Fact! The first thing to say is that stand-up comedy easily passes what I call the Peter Brook test. In 1968, the great theatre director Peter Brook published this book, The Empty Space, and in it he gives a profoundly simple definition of what theatre is. He says, "I can take any empty space and call it a bare stage. A man walks across this empty space while someone else is watching him, and this is all that is needed for an act of theatre to be engaged." I mean, stand-up comedy does way more than that, although it wouldn't be much of a show if that's all it did. Stand-up's so much better than that. And in fact, I'm going to name 6 ways in which stand-up comedians outstrip conventional actors. 1. Authorship. Hello, I'm an actor, and I write all my own material. Here's the thing I'm working on at the moment. I call it King Lear. The point is that whereas most actors just interpret other people's material, most comedians generate their own. I mean, it's true there are exceptions. Shakespeare was an actor, for example, and some comedians work with writers, but the fact is that rule is mostly true. Also, the scripts that comedians produce are really different from a playtext. With a playtext, you can kind of work out who the characters are, what the plot is, and so on. Whereas stand-up script is very, very different. So Josie Long is a young British comedian who broke through in the early 2000s with a delightful, whimsical, homemade style, really rooted in DIY culture and left-wing politics. Now, what you're looking at now is the script, essentially, for her show Romance and Adventure. And if you look at it, it's kind of hard to make sense of it. There's just these words everywhere. It's a spider diagram with things like Lanark, and phrases like 2012 till 2015, Spice Girls, Branson plus Ramjack, Tesco, I'm a Hypocrite, Dalston, Champagne Waterski. What do these things mean? I don't know, not really, and I saw the show. The only person who would know is Josie Long, and she might not even remember all of it now. She would have done when she did the show, and that's the point. The script comes from the comedian. 2. Acting. Normally, actors play one character, but comedians play many because they people the stage with their imagination, creating characters, set, props, humans, animals, from the air all around them, using just their body, their face, and their voice. The example I'm going to give of this is Richard Pryor, widely acknowledged as one of the all-time greats of stand-up. He started out in America in the 1960s with quite a clean-cut style, but then he radically reinvented himself in the 1970s with a much blacker, more earthy style, sharing the private humour of the African-American community with mixed-race audiences. His show, Live in Concert, is amazing. It was filmed in late 1978 and released to cinemas in 1979. And it contains a scene in which he shows you what happens when hunters go out into the woods. I'll show what it's like. It's kind of like this. You can see it so vividly and you can hear the crunching of leaves. And then he shows us a deer drinking and being surprised by the sound of the leaves crunching. And it's amazing because you kind of see him there. It's clearly just Richard Pryor, and he's barely doing anything. He's just standing with quite a still body and quite a still face. But at the same time, you can actually see the deer so vividly that it gets gales of laughter. It's incredible. 3. Audience.
You gave him right good full sucking. What's that idiot saying over there?
Charming. Stand-up is more theatrical than theatre because there's never a fourth wall separating performer from audience. Sarah Millikan is a brilliant comedian from the northeast of England. She has a very distinctive voice. It's high-pitched, it has a strong Geordie accent. And her style, I would describe it as warm, confessional, and, let's be honest, rude. One of the things she does is ask audiences about their experiences. So she might ask them, for example, have you ever broken anything during sex? And they come back with these amazing stories about stuff they've broken, like, for example, a lamp, a bed, a dessert table in a restaurant. And of course, she's very funny reacting to these, very quick on her feet, very quick-witted. But also she builds the routine night after night, audience after audience, because as well as finishing up with a story of her own, she'll incorporate the reactions of previous night's audiences in the current performance. It's a very beautiful and liberating thing to see people confessing to such intimate things in public like that. 4. Persona. In stand-up comedy, there's an inherent ambiguity about who that person is that you see on stage. It's different with acting, isn't it? Because you know there's a difference between actor and character. If you see Hamlet on the stage, you know he's not really Hamlet. You know he's really David Tennant because you've seen him on Doctor Who on telly, right? But with stand-up, it's persona. It's sort of an exaggerated version of the real person or something like that. We don't know how much that person we see on stage would resemble the person if we met them privately in everyday life. And that could be played with in a really interesting way. So take the British comedian Bridget Christie, for example. She used to work for the Daily Mail before she started in stand-up in 2004 with a delightfully silly style, which saw her do 2 Edinburgh comedy shows dressed as Charles II. Then she changed her style a bit more recently so that she was not only delightfully silly, but also righteously feminist, and won the Edinburgh Comedy Award in 2013 for her show A Bic for Her. Okay, so she really interestingly plays on this thing of who she is. So, for example, after a rant, she'll go, Here, I'm not a character comedian, you know. I'm not a spoof of a 1980s feminist comedian. I'm like this all the time. And by playing on that ambiguity, it opens up a space for her to say some really important things. Fun extra fact. A few years ago, a well-known British newspaper published a story about Charles II on its website. And they used an illustration which wasn't actually a picture of him. No, it was a photograph of Bridget Christie dressed as Charles II. And what was that newspaper? The Daily Mail. 5. Truth. Actors and theatre makers often talk about truth in theatre, but actually truth is far more interesting in stand-up comedy. And that's because the show never pretends to be happening anywhere other than the stage where it's happening. And also the person that's talking to us appears to just be a person talking to us, not a character. I'd liken the difference between theatre and stand-up to the story of Zeuxis and Parrhasius. Yes, I'm going that pretentious. So cast your minds back to 5th century BC Athens, where there's a contest happening between two painters to prove which is the better painter. And so they meet somewhere in the open air with their paintings covered with curtains, and Zeuxis goes first. He pulls the curtain back, and behind the curtain is a painting of grapes so realistic that birds fly down from the sky and try and peck the painted grapes. And you think, gosh, he's got to win, right? But then it's Parrhasius' turn, and Zeuxis says, come on, pull back the curtain. And Parrhasius says, no, it's not a curtain. It's my painting of a curtain. And the point is there that Zeuxis could fool birds, but Parrhasius could fool humans, right? And that's like theatre and stand-up. With theatre, you might be taken aback by how realistic the acting is, but you know it's acting. With stand-up, you're not sure what's true and what's not. And comedians can play with that in a really interesting way. So, for example, Eddie Izzard, the trans comedian from the UK who became big in the 1990s and still is very big, both in the UK and in America. Now, his 1998 show, Dressed to Kill, filmed in San Francisco, has this brilliant routine about how the singer Engelbert Humperdinck got his name. And at the end of the routine, he goes, but he's dead now. Do you hear that? Yeah, I saw it on CNN just before it came out. Yeah, that's weird. Yeah. And Frank Sinatra as well. He died recently. So, yeah. No, it's not true. It's not true. Yes, it is true. It's not. And then he goes through that cycle of claiming it to be true and not true 6 more times. Every time he does it, he gets another laugh because it's outrageously playing on that ambiguity of what's true and what's not. I mean, it's a bit like this right now. You know, am I actually in front of a virtual backdrop of a beach, or is it really a beach? It's a beach. No, it's a backdrop. No, it's a beach. 6, magic. So if you put all that stuff together, you realise stand-up is this incredible form. It's like magic. Stuart Lee started out in the British alternative comedy scene of the late 1980s before becoming a TV star in the 90s alongside Richard Herring. In the early 2000s, he gave up stand-up to return in about 2004 and become, to my mind, one of the all-time greats of the form because he kept pushing at what it was possible to do with stand-up. So in a recent show, he does a joke and the audience laugh a bit, but not a massive laugh. And he tells them that they've given him the wrong reaction. He says he's been touring the show for weeks and he knows exactly the laugh that bit should get and they haven't given it to him. And he talks about the pressure that audiences put comedians under. And he said, audiences like you as good as murdered Robin Williams. An outrageous thing to say, and it gets an outraged laugh. And then he talks about real comedians that he's known who've died. And he talks about historical examples of comedians who've died. And he says that it's because of the pressure that audiences put them under. And he says that when he walks out onto the stage, he's surrounded by dead comedians, people he's known. He says he walks out into a forest of ghosts. And he says the ones on this side say, don't let it get to you. Don't let it get you down. But the ones on this side say, join us, join us, join us. It's just so weird and spooky. So weird and spooky, in fact, that one comedy critic, seeing him do that, left the show to tweet that she'd just seen Stuart Lee having a nervous breakdown. I'm going to finish with this. It's a quote from Little Titch, who was a British music hall comedian in the late 19th, early 20th century. And he was so famous and successful that he gave a new word to the English language, even in his own lifetime, because the word titch, meaning somebody small, came to us from the music hall comedian Little Titch. And he was very bothered by the fact that actors get kudos much more than comedians, for example, in the honours system. And he wrote, "An actor is an actor, whether he plays Hamlet or wears the red nose and sloppy trousers of a vaudeville comedian. I maintain that on the score of individual ability, the variety star, in other words, the stand-up comedian, is usually the better actor of the two." I agree. Thank you very much indeed, and good night.
I'm still not sure whether there was a green screen or not. If you want to know more about the history of comedy, Oliver has published books and hosts a podcast about the topic. From one art form to the other, we're going to teleport you to South London, where our next performer was born. She's a singer, rap artist, and songwriter who, as you listen, doesn't mince words or shy away from talking about her feelings. Sit back, grab a drink, and remember the name. Ladies and gentlemen, Steve Mowgli.
I'm Steve Mowgli, and this is Aquarius Girl. Let's go. Whoa-oh. Oh, tripping over nothing, always sipping something, girl, you don't know when to stop. Your favourite sport is jumping to conclusions, never trusting. Love shouldn't be a competition, when you gonna learn? There shouldn't be concerns, red flags in plain sight. What's done in the dark will always find a way to shine a little bright. So bring the rose tints, prepare for a bumpy ride. I might decide to catch you just for one more night. Yeah, we'll lay down on the moonlit ground as the stars fall through the clouds, high as a rocket ship, piercing the atmosphere. You're here, and nothing beats when you're here. Aquarius go, Aquarius go, Aquarius go. You're here, and nothing beats when you're here. You got what's left of my heart in the palm of my hands. Girl, let's take a trip through the purple sand, and you're the only one that knows just what I'm talking about. Got me missing the way that you use your mouth. They put you down, I pick you up, you make the time, I make excuses out of fear of all the luck you've had. You never want to love again, but near enough with me, that's why I had to quit the fight, so we can live the fairy tale just one more night. Yeah, we'll lay down on the moonlit ground as the stars fall through the clouds, high as a rocket ship, piercing the atmosphere. You're here, and nothing beats when you're here. Aquarius go, Aquarius go. Whoa, Aquarius go. You're here, and nothing beats when you're here. Aquarius go. Woo! Alright, yeah. Okay. The next one is 9 Chalices. 9 chalices I hold, but cannabis I smoke, cause in this life it's like I suffer sleep paralysis when woke. Well spoken, but I choke on dreams of palaces untold. That analysis was cold, just like the feminine J. Cole. My soul can never be sold like Krispy Kremes to a fat king. And just because I'm a queen don't mean it can never be rap king. But I would rather sing them rap bars about bling, bitches, cars, money, and other shiny things. You feel me? Not worry about the cash or the fame, believe me, or hating bitches speaking on my name so freely. Just wondering if I will keep the wealth of my health when they put them flashing lights around my name and I still be me. If I were to call your phone when I made it, yeah, would you pick up the phone, baby, baby? If I were to call your phone when I made it, baby, pick up the phone, baby, baby. I vibe high all the time, apart from hiccups I won't mention. Blindfolded fool's journey tried to reach the fifth dimension. Big brown eyes forever capture my attention. So connection, if I entertain it, will I change direction? See, look how I've gone off topic. We can never stay platonic. Every breath becomes a sonnet, interfering with my logic. Melodies like these your heart sings, but the lyrics left unsaid. I just hope the fame don't go straight to my head and I forget. If I were to call your phone when I made it, yeah, would you pick up the phone, baby? If I were to call your phone when I made it, baby, pick up the phone, baby, baby, yeah, pick up the phone, baby, yeah, 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 yeah. Woo! Steve Mowgli, yeah, 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 yeah. Woo!
Thank you so much, Steve. That was a stunning performance. When our team decided to pivot our event to the virtual format, we actually brainstormed so many ideas about the places to film the talks. Now, I would like to take all of you to the Moorfields Eye Hospital in London, which is the largest and oldest center for eye treatment in the whole Europe. Our speaker, Siegfried Wagner, an ophthalmologist, is going to share a groundbreaking research project linking eye scanning data to the diagnosis of dementia. Now, please wash your hands, put on your masks, and follow me to the hospital.
Around 200 years ago, London became the largest city in the world. This was an exciting time. The first railways were introduced, the National Gallery was built, and the city established itself as a global hub of trade. However, it was a place tormented by frequent epidemics. Some of these were well-recognized infections of the day, like smallpox or cholera. But one of them had doctors scratching their heads. Hundreds of patients were being admitted with unexplained headaches, vomiting, seizures, and swelling of the legs. Some of them, strangely, were also going blind, often hours before their death. Now, it might surprise you to hear that the culprit of this was no infection. Rather, it was something that we couldn't yet detect, but affect many of us to some extent today: high blood pressure. What Dr. Richard Bright revealed to us in these descriptions was perhaps one of the earliest hints that the eyes could harbor diseases outside of the eyes. The problem was that technology hadn't kept up with scientific understanding, and we had to wait several decades before the invention of this, the ophthalmoscope, when we could reliably distinguish what was causing vision loss in these patients. So if you were to look at the back of my eye, the retina, this is what you'd see: a circular pink structure of the optic nerve, from which emanate the major blood vessels of the retina. What might Richard Bright have seen if he was able to examine his patient's eyes? Well, probably something like this. Now, on first glance, these images might appear quite similar, but look closer, and you'll notice red blots, suggestive of bleeding, fluffy yellow areas, indicating swelling or blocked nerves, and in severe cases, a lack of clarity of the border of the optic nerve, suggestive of swelling of the brain. Fast forward almost 200 years, and we know that our eyes show much more than just the state of our blood pressure. Changes in the retina can reflect a multitude of diseases, from common conditions like diabetes to uncommon infections like tuberculosis. In fact, you'd be hard-pressed to think of a chronic disease that doesn't have a manifestation somewhere within the eye. Now, it doesn't take an expert to look at these two images and realize that they're different. But not all changes are as clearly discernible to us. What if I were to instead show you another pair of seemingly normal images, but tell you that one of these patients will develop a stroke within the next 3 years, and that this prediction can be made through the eye. It's unlikely that any of us would be much more accurate than tossing a coin. One option for identifying structures that may not be obvious to us is deep learning, a subfield of artificial intelligence where patterns are discovered using large datasets. With this tool, we've realized that images of the retina don't just tell us about disease, they can tell us about ourselves. In the last few years, we've seen that eyes can show our age, our sex, whether we smoke, whether we're anemic, and give us an indication of our risk of future events, like heart attack or stroke, all from a single picture of the back of the eye. Now, the focus on heart attack and stroke is deliberate. Collectively, these so-called cardiovascular diseases are the leading cause of mortality worldwide. But many of us will have personal experience of a new villain that has emerged as the #1 cause of death in the United Kingdom, and that is dementia. Dementia is rising at an alarming rate in the context of the aging population. And even more concerning is that it's estimated that around 50% of cases are undiagnosed globally. So it's important that we develop effective strategies for identifying those at risk. Modern scanning technology has not only redefined how we treat eye diseases, but they've helped further our understanding of the links between the eye and the brain. The retina is derived from the same tissue as the brain, and the circuitry connecting the two means that changes in one are often reflected in the other. For example, one landmark study from the Netherlands showed that thinner nerves were found in the retinas of people with dementia, and also several years before developing any symptoms of it. They were able to show this with less than 100 patients. But applying deep learning to this problem requires much larger datasets. And that's why we spent the last couple years at Moorfields, the largest eye hospital in Europe and North America, linking our retinal scans with national hospital admissions data. Our outside cohort comprises more than 5 million retinal scans, and 15,000 patients in our cohort have developed dementia. The prospect of eye scans for dementia screening is attractive, given the challenge of diagnosis. This typically relies on symptoms, which are a late manifestation of the disease, or the concerns of a friend or family member. And awareness is only the beginning. Along this arduous path, individuals first need to consult their general practitioner, complete a non-specific questionnaire, be referred to a specialist, and have blood tests to rule out secondary causes of dementia. Finally, they need to undergo scans, which are often expensive, time-consuming, and potentially invasive, all before revisiting their specialist to discuss the results. All this invariably leads to frustration and anxiety. But high-resolution eye scanning technology can show us even subtler changes with microscope-like resolution in a non-invasive, risk-free approach that takes seconds to acquire. And much like the field of genetics, where sequencing a person's genome is a fraction of the cost it was 10 years ago, each season sees greater affordability in retinal scanning technology. To put this into perspective, at Moorfields, we did around 25,000 eye scans in the 12 months of 2008. We now do more than that each month. And this technology isn't just limited to the hospital or clinic. It's increasingly available in the community. For example, Specsavers, one of the world's largest optician businesses, now has high-resolution scanning in nearly 700 of its branches in the United Kingdom. But if eye scans are a potential solution, how do we actively encourage the public to consider having them? Well, vision is precious. Surveys consistently show that we treasure our sight above any other sense. Some are even willing to trade 5 years of life to remain with their sight intact. And this is not just an opinion. This powerful sentiment translates into our health-seeking behavior. And here's an example. When you turn 40, chances are that you'll be invited to a general health check, where among other things, your risk of having a heart attack or stroke will be estimated. But how many of us actually take that up? Between 2009 and 2013, in the United Kingdom, it was around 9%. But what if we consider a similar age group, similar time, but instead rephrase the question? How many do you think report seeing their optometrist at least every 4 years? A very telling 80%. The current landscape of community healthcare and technological development has us at an exciting crossroads. And not just in Europe and North America, but low and middle income countries are also undergoing infrastructural transformation with the introduction of affordable eye scanning technology and regional eye health programs. Some of these scans can even be taken using your standard smartphone. By combining our understanding of how the eyes change in systemic diseases with artificial intelligence, the growing availability of eye scanning technology, and our natural concern for our vision, we can democratize access to a comprehensive health evaluation. Not through a visit to your primary care doctor, blood tests, or a long wait for that hospital MRI scan, but through a single picture taken in the blink of an eye.
Wow, amazing and promising research from Dr. Wagner. Well, folks, we've come to that time, our final talk. It is my privilege to introduce to you Ray Reeder, an MBA alumna of London Business School. She has a background in public health, women's empowerment, and human rights, and has worked in more countries than I've visited: Nepal, Jordan, and Tanzania, to name a few. Ray is passionate about food and enjoys making it, eating it, and sharing it with others. I'm secretly hoping that one day I get to try her baked goods. You'll know why after the talk. Here is Ray to share her story with you.
I'm not really sure when my love affair with baking started. My dad's a scientist and my mom's an artist, and I guess baking has always felt like a common compromise between the two. I think it's that the baking process has balance to it. You have to follow directions to ensure everything is in proportion. But to make something truly inspired, you have to trust your instincts and be creative and take risks. You have the latitude to make things up and try new flavors. And if something goes wrong, the worst thing that can happen is that things will look a bit weird or won't rise right. Because if you put enough sugar in, it will probably still taste fine. When I was younger, baking was a way to connect. It was a method to cover up a social anxiety other people didn't see. To reach across the space I felt existed between myself and others, and make myself central to experiences I felt inherently peripheral to. In pictures throughout my life, my back is to the camera as someone else blows out the candles in whatever I've created. Baking the birthday cake was a way to ensure an invitation to the birthday party. At my first job post-university, I used the same tactic. Each Sunday, I would bake lavender cookies or shortbread or a crumble, and each Monday I would be rewarded with a series of visitors to my desk. I grew to know my colleagues based on their flavor preferences. Bob, our COO, liked almonds. Phil from accounting loved cherries, and Sarah always took seconds of lemon curd. On my last day of that first job, my director gave me 2 pieces of advice. The first was that I had too expressive a face, that everyone always knew exactly what I was thinking. She was 100% right, and the feedback didn't come as a surprise. But the second was that I should stop bringing baked goods to work. And that took me back. My baking had allowed me to forge relationships throughout the organization and given me face time with senior execs. How could any of that be a bad thing? Then she asked if I had ever seen a man cut a cake at an office party. Ever watched one walk around with his hands full of slices on paper plates asking who wanted one? And I realized I hadn't. She said if I was always focused on giving out food at the office, I would never be the one having an important discussion over it. After that conversation, I started to doubt myself. Not because of my expressive face. That's a lifelong cross to bear. But because I didn't know how to reconcile who I was with what I wanted to become. Baking felt inherently feminine in a way that seemed small and silly and antithetical to success. Making a cake seemed at odds with making an impact. How could a passion for human rights and a passion for pies live in one person? How could I be soft in a world that was so hard? I began to fear that being a baker meant that I would always be holding the cake, never blowing out the candles. That being a woman meant that I would always be setting the table instead of sitting at it. Professionally, I started working around the world in areas of social justice and public health, eventually settling into women's rights. I spoke about our cause with just the right amount of conviction. I wore power skirts and high heels and lipstick. I took up space and I wasn't overly warm. I learned to control my expressive face. No one would ever know what I was thinking again unless I wanted them to. I hid all my soft parts away, filed down my rough edges, swallowed my extremes. I was a strong woman, perfectly enough, perfectly not too much. But on the weekend, after I had sent reports to people in different time zones, I would put on flip-flops and sneak down to the market and buy flour and cream so I could make blueberry scones. It was a shameful secret, and I filed it away with all the others. Alongside my B for baking was E for emotional and excitable, personality traits I kept carefully in check. C for crying, a sin I would only commit behind closed doors. P for just pretty enough to be listened to, but not enough to be distracting. And M for the motherhood I wasn't sure I would ever let myself want, given how it might impact my career. On the other side of the room were another set of files. S for all the times I stayed silent when I should have said something. J for all the instances where I joked along because I didn't know what else to do. L for the way I laughed a little too loudly when my boss touched my knee. And F for freeze. Because in the world of fight or flight that was and is my go-to move. My shame-filled filing cabinets took up my whole living room. There was no space to move around all the parts of myself I thought I needed to hide. In children, the capacity to feel shame develops between the ages of 2 and 3. 2 years old and they understand guilt. 2 years old and they're already being taught which parts of themselves to hide and which parts are for popular consumption. Which experiences are palatable and which are unsightly. I've heard that shame is just anger turned inward, but I don't think that's exactly right. It implies that the person experiencing it is an active player in their own suffering, when it's the world around us that has taught us to bite our tongues. In reality, shame is a tool of homogenization. We internalize because not doing so puts us at risk. Because saying our truths is a sacrifice many of us cannot afford to make. Not only because others might be deaf to our realities, but because saying them aloud may diminish our capacity to have our voices heard in the future. I was a woman passionate about women's rights and still scared to exhibit any wrong aspect of my femininity. Scared it would keep me from a seat at the table. Scared it would keep me from being taken seriously in conversations about the construct of gender itself. It's not that I didn't see the contradiction. It's that I didn't see a way to dismantle it. I thought that the only way to change societal expectations was to conform and creep inside of structures and shift them slowly from the inside out. But in forfeiting parts of myself, I wasn't reshaping the structures that had created the shame. The shame I was filing away was reshaping me. There is something else that notably happens around a child's second birthday. They begin to feel empathy, to see others in all of their pain and all of their chaos and all of their dreams and meet them where they are. Accept them for who they are. Find themselves in the scheme of humanity. Perhaps our capacity to experience empathy and our capacity to feel shame are intrinsically linked when we develop them. Not because we need to feel shame to extend empathy, but the opposite. Because we need to extend empathy in order to alleviate shame. Many of us struggle to fit in to this confusing and treacherous world. We see our own inner workings, all of our deviances, all of our weakest moments. We feel shame, such intense, brutal shame, for not fitting an ideal we had no hand in creating, an image that doesn't match our desires, let alone our values. We see our own humanity, and it looks wrong. And thus, when we see it in others, we feel disgust. We turn away from their vulnerability. We reinforce their shame. We forget our birthright of compassion so quickly while accepting society's expectations of us. I'm trying to shift my perspective to see people in the context of their humanity, instead of in spite of it. And it's really, really hard. Empathy is a muscle that can be extended, and there are parts of mine that has absolutely atrophied. It feels permissive and weak and small to accept my own flaws. And the world becomes a lot more nuanced and confusing when people's beauty lies in their imperfections. But in listening to the volumes of my silences, my jaw is unlearning how to bite my tongue. And I am learning that my worth doesn't come in my ability to feel flawless, but in being human. Leaning into other shortcomings, I'm learning that there's nothing more stunningly amazing than the areas where we fall short. And that I'm more comfortable with the tapestry of humanity and my portion of it when I filter out ideas of what it should look like. It's so confusing. Everything seems out of control. It's come at the cost of seats at many tables. Tables I used to aspire toward, and seats I didn't know I was giving up. But it feels right. And by clearing out my cabinets, I'm finding a living room I can invite people into. One where maybe I can build a table of my own. I no longer feel the need to bake a cake in order to be invited to the party. If you've received a cake from me, rest assured that isn't why. There are some parties I don't want to be invited to. And some parties I'm invited to that do not deserve a cake. But even though I now share it selectively, I do still love to bake. It's taught me pride in what I have to bring to the table and perspective to appreciate what other people can teach me. The differences, the idiosyncrasies, the things that taste interesting are what make baking beautiful. In my baking, I'm bold and creative and strong and soft in different proportions all at once for different recipes. I'm shameless. I don't know if I can be that person outside of the kitchen, but I want to try. I'm still figuring out how to reconcile all of the parts of me into one whole. I'm still trying to resist the urge to hide the mess under the bed. I still wonder whether, by speaking my experiences aloud, I'll be seen as fragile. And I question why fragility is something I fear when I know in reality it's all any of us ever are. I don't have the answers. I'm still a work in progress. I always will be.
And with this beautiful and intimate moment from Ray, we have come to the end of this 10th edition of TEDx London Business School. We hope you're glad to have embarked on this 2-day trip with us, and that you now feel even slightly more aware of some of these gaps that surround you.
Some thank yous are in order. Firstly, a warm thank you to Daniel, Arthur, Oliver, Siegfried, Ray, and Steve Mowgli for sharing their ideas and art with us. Next, a special thank you to our sponsors and event partners for their support, including White Light, Fish Eye Group, London Business School, LBS Institute of Innovation and Entrepreneurship, and David Foster. We would also like to thank our entire team of TEDx volunteers, LBS students who gave their valuable time to ensure all of this happened, despite numerous obstacles and setbacks. Last, but definitely not least, a huge thank you to our advisors, Audrey Mandela, Jeff Skinner, and Sean Phelan, without whom we would have been aimless as to what makes a great TEDx event.
Finally, thank you for being here, for supporting all these initiatives during such troubled times. Please take care and be safe. Remember, this too shall pass. We would like to see all of you next year, hopefully in person.